Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we'll continue our discussion on the full stack development. If you're not familiar with my channel, please go ahead, take a look at some of the videos that I make. I talk about various technologies, starting from Springboot, Java, Angular, React, and whatnot. And if you have not watched the last couple of videos, I would really suggest please go ahead and take a look at it. Now, typically go to this playlist if you want to look at the list of playlists that I have. And it will end up in this. And this is the series that I have started building, Full Stack Web Development Masterclass. Of course, do look at other playlists and the videos as well. But today's discussion will be a continuation of this playlist right here. So if you click on this playlist, you will see there's like 3 videos. The first one, of course, talks about in general what does full stack development do for you, and these two basically talks about in that full stack development how to do a client in Angular and basically a server in Node.js and Express.js. So we're going to continue the discussion, and today we'll actually do a server that is done in Springboot and connected to MongoDB, and we'll still use the Angular client. So this is kind of like a continuation. Now, of course, if you have not watched the other 2 videos, it will definitely help you to follow up, and it will also help you to kind of find the context. But if you have not watched it, it's probably okay. I will do my best to kind of connect the dots and show you exactly what we did and where we're going to start. Okay, let's get to it. Okay, I will reiterate some of the stuff that we talk about in these 2 videos very quick so that you can catch up. The first thing you're going to need is Node.js, so go ahead, download Node.js. And all of these links I have put in the description of all of those videos that I just showed. And also I'm going to put all of these links in the description below of this video as well, so you'll have them. And they are also there in the GitHub link as well. Anyway, so you're going to need the Node.js, then you're going to need some kind of IDE. So I like to use Visual Studio Code for my Node.js and JavaScript development, as well as Angular. So you can use anything else, but again, if you want to follow along with what I'm doing, it's probably better to use this one. So get that, Visual Studio Code. The next thing you're going to need is a MongoDB account, and it's free. So just go to this link and just sign up. And once you have the MongoDB account, go ahead, create a database, and all of this thing has been described in details in this video right here. Anyway, so once you log into the MongoDB and you create the database based on the other videos that I just mentioned, you will have something like a database schema and then in a table/collections. So that's basically what this is. All I have is basically a list of users that's got all of these attributes, right? First name, last name, username, the password attached, some salary, some age, and what authorities they have for this data. So they are only 2 authorities. One is role_user, the other one is role_admin. So admin can pretty much do everything. Users cannot do everything. They cannot look at they cannot edit or add other users. They also cannot look at stuff like salary information, user ID. So that's basically it. That is the application. But anyway, once you have all this, of course, you are told to check out the code, which is available right here. You can click on this and get the Git URL. So that's also going to be in the description below. The link will be provided, and they're also provided in the other videos. Okay, and one other thing that you will see, of course, this flowchart, this kind of talks about what we have done so far, right? So as I was just telling you, download all this, create and register MongoDB, get the code, and then you're going to start the client, and then you're going to start the server. The client is in Angular, and anytime you see this kind of like a oval type little shape, that means it's a client. Anything you see boxy type shape, that's like a server. So you're going to have a client and a server. The client is done on Angular and the server is done on Node.js. That's what we explained in the previous videos. What we're going to do, we're going to extend this now. We have a client, so we're not going to do anything with the client. The client will not interact with a Springboot REST API, Springboot server that connects to the exact same database that you created, right? So that's basically what we're going to talk about. Okay, so let's get to it. Okay, the first thing you're going to need in order to look at the code is some kind of Java IDE, right? And I like to use Eclipse But again, you're welcome to use other popular IDE like JDeveloper or Intel IJ. Absolutely fine. But again, if you want to follow along, you can of course download the version that appropriate for you based on your platform, whether Mac, Windows, or Linux. But I'm going to use the Eclipse ID for enterprise Java and web developers. So that's it. So you're going to need that. Go ahead, download that. And by default, it comes with like Java 17. But again, you don't have to use Java 17. You can like plug in other Java as well. Anyway, next up is once you have the Eclipse, of course, as I mentioned, go ahead, check out the latest version of the code, right? So you can do it multiple ways. One way is, of course, you can open a command prompt, and assuming that you already have JIT installed, you go to your favorite directory and do git clone, and this is the repository link. And I'm not going to do it because I've already done that. So that will definitely check out all of the code that's required. There are other ways to do it as well, of course. Let's say if you have the IDE up, so right now I have Eclipse up, and this also works for other IDE as well. Intel IJ has a way to do it, JDeveloper has a way to do it, and so on with other IDEs. You could do like a file import, and then instead of importing the project after you checked out, you can directly check it out using this JIT module right here. You could say something like project from JIT, and you could say next, and you could say clone URI next. I already have the URL in URI in there, so you could see it right there. And again, you don't need to use any password. I just had it pre-filled. This is a public repository, so you won't use this anyway. And hit next, and it will automatically understand what that is. It will give you the default branch, which is main, and you can just keep going with that next, and then choose your directory and check it out that way. So that's one way, right? The only thing you don't want to do is after hit next, it may ask you that you have to go and import as a project, which you don't want to do it because I have not checked it in as an Eclipse project. I only have checked it in as a normal Maven project. So at that point, after hitting next, after you get it checked out, you hit cancel, and you're gonna have to import a Maven project, right? So anyway, just wanted to show it that you could do it either way. You could either go the command line way by doing git clone and clone the repository, or you can do directly from Eclipse. Either way that you do it, you will end up in a directory called user management, right? Will be something like this, and you can show it also in the Windows Explorer. Will be something like this, and you'll have all this code right here. Once you have the code checked out, you wanted to go to like file, import, and again, I'm showing it in Eclipse. The other IDE has a way to do it as well. You wanted to go to existing Maven project. So this is going to be in the Maven module right here. Existing Maven projects, click next, and then you wanted to put the directory exactly, right? I already know the directory where my project is, at least, so I kind of pasted that, and I'm going to go ahead and click browse so that I can choose the exact subdirectory that I want. It's in server, and this is the subdirectory that I want. That's where I have the Maven pom.xml. That's where you're after. So that's exactly what I did, and it found that pom.xml, and you can go ahead and click finish. Once you do it, it will automatically import all the necessary stuff that's required, and it will also go ahead and update whatever library that it's needed, right? So I kind of already did, and there's the code and everything nice and dandy. Of course, I'm gonna go ahead and run it quick. So you can right click on this file right here, auth API application, and go to debug and go ahead and run Java application. That way you can run it in here. So I'm going to use this ID to show you and explain the Java code. But if you want to just run it, of course, as I mentioned, you can run it from here, but you can also run both of your client and the server, like Angular client and also the Springboot server from Visual Studio Code. Let me show you how. So let's say you checked out the code in this directory. For me, I checked out in this directory. If I now do code dash space dot, it will automatically bring out the Visual Studio Code in that specific directory, right? I already have it up, so I'm not going to do it again. So here it is, and it brings up, as you could see, and shows all the subdirectories, as you could tell, right? Because as I showed you, this is how the subdirectory looks like, all that. So all that is in here, and the next thing that I have is, of course, I got two terminals here open, right, which you can get by doing this in terminal, and then you can also get it from here too, here command prompt. So in one terminal, I went to the other subdirectories called client and Angular, and this is where the first thing you want to do is npm install, where you would actually run and kind of build the entire thing. I've already have it built, so it's not going to take much time. In your case, it may take a little while. And then you could just do npm start, which will automatically start the Angular client, because you want to have the Angular client up so that it interacts with the server. Okay. The next thing is I'm going to go ahead and have to start the server. So I have the second command prompt, and I also already did the directory to the server, and that Springboot directory, that's where I have my project as I was showing you in the Eclipse. So all you have to do here, if you want to run this client and the server on the exact same IDE like in Visual Studio Code, just go ahead and run on the Springboot mvn space springbwt with the dash, of course, and then :run. If you just do that, it will automatically go ahead and start the server for you. As you can see, it is accepting traffic. Once you have that, you got your client up here, that's in Angular, and you got your server up, that is in Spring Boot and Tomcat, right? Then all you have to do is try the client. So let's go ahead and try it. So the client would be in this thing, localhost 4200. So as you can see, the client is up and running, and I'm going to go ahead and try to log in. There you go. I tried logging in, and voila, I am logged in. But now it's Angular, but it's actually contacting, or it's interacting with Spring Boot client. How do I know that? You can actually go back and look at some of these things, and you can see what it's doing, right? It is actually looking at all of these list of logs, and you can see that it is getting some results, and it was actually getting some gets and posts and stuff like that. So you can just look at the log, and you can see there's user ID password that's being passed. So that's how I know it. Now, so that same exact application is working, and of course I can add new user, and I could say user this, and maybe this is an administrator, and try put some junk here, some salary, and add, and it has been added, and it's all nice and good, and I can log out, and I can log back in as that user, right? And voila, I'm actually in, and I can see that I'm as that user, right? So basically the whole thing is working, and let me try something else as well. I'm going to log in as the normal administrator and go to that user. I think this is the guy that I added. I'm going to go ahead and edit that guy and say that guy is a user now. And let's go ahead and try to update that. And let's go to update, and it updated successfully. Log out, try to log in as that user. You will see that user permission has changed, of course. So, I mean, it is all functional as we want. We'll log back in as a normal user with all privileges that what I use all the time. And I'm going to go ahead and delete that guy. And there you go, it's gone. Okay, so everything is functional, as you can see. Now let's go talk about the code. Okay, if you're not familiar with the Spring Boot or Spring Security, I will really suggest to go to their site and take a look at some of the documentation and try to understand how their design is done, right? And what is Spring Boot and how this thing is organized together. Of course, this tutorial is not scoped around every nitty-gritty detail of these technologies, but all I can tell you is they have very good documentation, and go ahead and start with that, at least if you're not familiar with it at all. So I'm assuming that you are already kind of familiar with Spring Boot, and Java somewhat. So let's look at the code. So if you open your IDE, in my case it was an Eclipse that I imported the code, the very first thing you want to do is, okay, whenever you run the application on the client, some of the thing that it does as I have mentioned in the previous videos, if you look at it, it calls certain APIs, right? The very first thing that happens is when you click on login, it actually calls a login API, and that's how it actually logs in, right? So it literally calls in, and again, this is also something that I talked about in the previous videos. I use a plugin extension called Rested, which is a very lightweight tool that I like to use. You can use Postman and other API testing tool that also works, but this kind of works great for me. So I'm going to use that. So all it's doing is it is listening to port 8080 localhost, and it is going to this URL, auth login, right? The very first thing. That's what the Angular calls as soon as you hit this login button, all right? How do I know this? Go ahead, look at the code. I describe it in the previous video in details, exactly how this is done and what it's doing from the Angular. So Angular literally calls this URL, and then in this URL, what happens is I put my user ID, or once I put my user ID and password, right, whatever the password is, it will automatically make a post call, right? That's what Angular does. And the post call is received by the Springboot, and then the Springboot will process it, right? So let's do it. Here's a password, and then I'm going to go ahead and make a call. And voila, as you could see, it works. And you can go to this thing, and as you could see right there, it did, and it got even user list, and everything is being called, and everything is nice and good. So that's exactly what it's doing in the background. So your Spring Boot is actually kind of working as a REST API server, if that makes sense, right? So let's get to the code again. There are several parts to the Spring Boot app, or Spring Boot REST API. The very first thing I want to look at that is interesting is, of course, the configuration, right? The base configuration start with the properties. So if you go look at the properties, so I basically expanded the source main resources, you will see similar environment variable that we talked about in previous videos when we set up the Express.js, right? This environment variable literally has the path or URI to the Mongo database, and this one has the database name. So again, this is coming from the exact same environment variable as we did in Express.js. No change there. If you already have those set up, that's great. If you don't have it set up, please go ahead and look at the video, especially this guy right here, this video right here. That's where I talk about how to set the environment variable and what environment variable to set for the MongoDB database. So that's these two. Now, the other stuffs are pretty simple. Just leave it, don't change it. Basically saying what is the authentication database for MongoDB, and these are all Spring specific properties that you wanted to set, and what's the name of the key that you wanted to set in the JSON JWT token for the roles. So that's what that is, and what is the prefix of the token that you want to call it. You can say anything. Typically, standard is to use bearer token. You could put anything else you want. So that's the prefix. So it's all dynamic. Then what header string that we're interesting, of course, all this JWT token will be setting authorization. That's also not hard-coded. You can literally get it from this properties file, and you can even put it in environment variable. Now this guy is the what signing key JWT will use. We had a similar thing on our Express.js. If you remember, what we did is we literally base64 encoded the Mongo URI, which was unique for us, and then we use that as a key. I have done exact same thing here too, but I still kept this as a environment variable, which you're welcome to use. You can set this environment variable as a key. Make sure it's 256 character, because that's what it expects. Otherwise, you will throw an error. But you don't have to. This is just there for you to see. You can do that as well. I'll show you in the code what this is used. Then the validity is set in milliseconds. This is literally 30 minutes if you do the calculation. And I just set the debug flag to true so that I can see all the details in the log. So that's basically what these things are. All right, once you have these properties set, now let's go to the code. The very first thing I'm going to look at in the code is the configuration, right? Now you'll notice that there's two configuration. One says security configuration, the other one is JWT authentication filter. Of course, we're going to need both of these. The security configuration is a standard Springboot security configuration that will rely on the JWT authentication filter, because this entire security, the Spring Security version 6, this is actually using the latest security model, it's using the JWT token. So it is using a filter, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then, of course, it has the standard Spring Security requires that if you have a security model, you need multiple things. For example, you need an authentication manager. The authentication manager interacts with authentication provider class. That authentication provider is going to be the one interacting with how the authentication is done. It's done, of course, using two things. One is a JWT token, but then once it validates the token, it actually extract the claims. The claims are kind of like what are the information that you're putting in or encrypting inside the token. Like in our case, it will be user IDs. It will be also a whole bunch of authorities in there as well, right? So those informations are going to be in there, but those information, after extracting it, you will need to put it somewhere, right? And we're putting into the database, and that's where user detail service comes in. In user detail service model, it interacts with the user, a specific type of class, and that's where it will store its credentials and users and other information like authorities, right? So that's what this thing is in brief. And of course, we are not showing the text password. We're using a hashed password that's stored in the database, because that is the best standard security practice. And what is it using? It is using Spring security standard recommended way to encode the password or hash it is bcrypt, and that's what this password encoder is. And because these are standard code, you got to get this so that Spring understands what the authentication manager is coming from. And this is where it is. The authentication manager can have multiple authentication provider, one or more, right? In this case, we only have one, that is the DAO, right? But there are ways, again, that's out of the scope of this tutorial. You can actually have multiple. I can have a JWT token provider. I can also have an Okta provider. I can also have something else like a social media provider. So all that is possible. But right now, we're only providing one type of security using user ID and password. And that is DAO is like data access objects. It's literally connecting to the database and getting the user ID password or setting it back, or not necessarily password, a hashed copy of the password. So that's what this is, and it is setting the user detailed service, saying that this is my service class that will handle all that, rigmarole of details of how to handle the users and all that. And then this is the password encoder we're using. So that's as simple as that. This piece is pretty important. This is where a lot of security checks is happening. This is also another standard security filter chain that you need to use on Spring Boot if you're using Spring Security. Of course, right now I am getting two parameters. That's where the nice dependency injection comes in. I have the HTTP security parameter. I also have authentication manager, which comes from there, which will have the provider itself. So, of course, I start with, this is not a web application. This is a REST API, so I don't worry about CSRF. So in the beginning, I'm disabling that standard. Then this is where the security piece comes in. I'm basically restricting certain things. As you could look at this, it's basically saying, hey, I have my HTTP request, but make sure anytime, the options are kind of like, before, when you're interacting with an Angular client, the Angular, when it sends a post or get or whatever request, the first thing it does is also a request called options request, just to check if that site is up or not, or that thing is function that it can actually send, get, or post request. So the option request, you have to open it for everything, because it doesn't send any sensitive information. It's just kind of like a ping. It just says, hey, are you there or not? And also finds out all the options that's available in the header. So that's what this thing is. So you got to have this to say that permit all for this type of HTTP methods. Then the next thing is, of course, anytime you have any URL that starts with auth, of course, permit all, because that there will only be like login and log out, and that needs to be accessible to the whole world, right? That's how the user will be able to log in. That's why it's permit all. There's no restriction. But take a look at the next one. Next one says, hey, whenever you are doing something like a user or this kind of user's me, which actually that I'm thinking, I don't have that, so I can actually remove this thing. I don't think I have this. So I only have the users. Whenever I have the users, that means that, just getting the list of users. That's basically what this is. That needs to be accessible by user with role, user or admin. So basically everyone has access to it, right? After you're authenticated. So that's what that basically means, because you're not going to have this role if you're not authenticated. So you can't just go and start saying users and it will work. It's not going to work. I'll show you in a second. Then the next thing it's saying, okay, after users, anything else that's being called, which is, of course, there could be a get, there could be insert, there could be an update. That's good. And there can also be a delete. And after delete, there may be who are you deleting. All of these can only be permitted by admin. A normal user cannot access it. So that's basically what this is saying. So this is how the security is being checked. And then, of course, it's basically saying any request for all of this needs to be authenticated. That's that is. And then, of course, it's got the standard stateless session, because this is just an API. And then this is where you're providing, fine, you're saying that it needs to be restricted with the security, HTTP security, but how are we going to authenticate it? This is where you're providing the authentication manager that's being passed, that's injected based on what we mentioned in these beans. And then, of course, the next thing is also important. Now it says, okay, you got the authentication manager, but we also have a request filter, right? That is a JWT authentication filter. Make sure you go through that. So let's look at that. And in that filter, it also says that what type of filter this is. This is user password authentication filter, right? So let's go look at that guy. So that guy is nothing but saying, hey, I got a JWT authentication filter that is this class right here. So let's look in details. Now, if you recall all of those properties that we set on the application properties right here, so some of these properties that you will see that will come into play, like what are the header strings that we're interested in, what are the token prefix that we're interested in. These are like bearer, and this is like authorization, right? That's what we're interested in. So the next thing you can pay attention is this is filter is extending what? Once per request filter. That basically says every time a request happens, it needs to go to this filter, and that's exactly what's going to happen. Of course, we have some standard exception handler that we are just auto wiring, and then we also need some service classes. So we have our custom JWT service, and we'll talk about that. And we also have a user detail service that, of course, is standard one that we're going to need that. This one is needed to get some standard stuff like, we need to, let's say, get a JWT token or decode a token, validate a token, check those things, sign it. So stuff like that is done in here, right? And then this one basically just getting the user information from the user detail service. Now, anytime you extend a filter, you're gonna have to override this do filter internal method, and that's exactly what this is doing. And of course, it's got all of this thing. The first thing that you could see it does is, of course, get the header, right? And it sets some standard header. That's very important. You are here, of course, I commented on this code, but you can literally put like list of origins that you want to allow. I am just allowing start. That means anyone can go ahead and call this API. And then, of course, you got to have credential line true, and also saying what are the methods that are being accepted. So, of course, as you can see, delete, get, option, post, input that are accepted, and what's the maximum age of this request, and then, of course, some other things that it says what type of stuff that it accepts, like the header, what does it accept. So that's the thing. So the very first thing it's doing is, as you could see, it is getting the authorization string, right? A header from the header, basically. So it checks that, hey, is my header null? If it's null and it does not start with a token prefix, meaning that, hey, the very first time you come to the login page, you're not passing in token, right? It's just a login page. So in that case, go ahead, don't need to do anything. just call the parent do filter method and return, and you're done. That's what this is saying. However, if your authorization header is not null, and it will start with token prefix, and that's what this is, right? It's not null, and it will start with token prefix, then we got to do some work, right? The first thing it does is it strips out the bearer part. This is exactly what this is, because this header, it's getting the authorization. Remember, the authorization header will look like this, right? Bearer, space, and all this token, right? So let's come back to that. So what this code is doing is literally stripping out that first 7 characters, the bearer and space, and then getting the JWT token, right? After getting it the JWT token, it is using the JWT service to extract the username from that token, right? So there's the username, and then after it gets the username, then the next thing it does, it basically gets the authentication from the security. At this point, it will be null. It will not have anything because we have not validated anything. We're just looking at the header, right? We need to look at the JWT token and set this properly. And look, this is what it's doing. It's basically saying, look, my username is not null. That means my token, I was able to successfully retrieve my username. It's a valid token, but my authentication is null. If that is the scenario, then what we are doing is we are using our user detail service. Using that service, what we are getting is load users by username. So we are getting like a value that is based on the username, right? This is the standard service class, and that is already connected. So this internally will eventually call, I'll show you what method that gets called, and then we're getting the user detail. This will have all the information about the user and the authorities, right? Then the other thing it's doing, once we're getting this, then we're also checking the validity of the token. We need to make sure that the token is valid, and that's where, again, it's taking the help of the JWT service, checking if is the token valid or not, how we are passing the user detail information with the authorities and everything, and also we are passing the token. And then when this is valid, then what it's doing is it's creating a user password authentication token object, right, out of the user detail. And this is just credential. We can have it now because we want to put the credential in this. Once we authenticated, we are good. And then it gets the list of authorities that is available, like whether it's role admin or role user in our case. But you can have multiple authorities as well. Then what it's doing is it's basically saying, hey, I have created this authentication token, and I'm going to go ahead and set the details, right? This out of this authentication token that is created right here, I'm going to set details, and you wanted to set some of the web authentication details parameter based on the request. So that's how you do it. And then the last thing is you're getting the securities context and setting the authentication back to this type of authentication, which is user password authentication token. Remember, at this point, this authentication was null, right? And then go ahead and call this filter, do filter method. So that's all this thing is doing. All right. Now remember, the next time it comes in, and if the token is it's got the right authentication and the token is all good, it will not go through this entire thing, right? And then of course that's it. Now let's go and dig into the JWT service just to show you how it looks, right? So let's go to the service because it uses a lot of this JWT service thing. This is also another interesting thing. Remember, it is using the MongoDB URI because I told you that that's something that we're going to use to set the secrets for the signing, right? We're going to do base64 encoding and then use that for signing. Token validity, all these are getting from the properties file. Now here, if you remember, I mentioned this guy right here that you don't need to set it, but you have an option. You can also set this thing in your environment variable to do the secret. So that's exactly what this is happening here, right? I commented out because you'll see that I'm making the signing key based on this URI and I'm going to 64 base64 encoding. All right, so a whole bunch of methods. One is generate token, and this is the one that's used, to generate a token. Of course, it needs some user information, so it gets the user information, The username information is nothing but it's just gonna get it from whatever method that calls. It will get the user information because we will pass like user and then password at least, right? So based on the user ID, it will get this piece of information. Then it will also try to set what are the list of authorities that is available, right? Or that needs to be there, right? Initially, it's probably going to be all null. But anyway, then what we're doing is we are literally building the token. And here we're saying that, okay, in the token, we'll have a whole bunch of claims. And the claims, this extra claims is nothing but we're going to put some authority keys. You can also put more stuff in there too as a key value pair. And the subject is nothing but you're getting it from the username and issued at when and when it's going to expire. That's where it takes the token validity parameter and signs with get signed key. Let's look at that method that is right here. And here, as I was telling you, that I'm using the MongoDB URI, same thing as I did in ExpressDB, encoding it and making that my signing key. But you're welcome to use this guy as well. Then you don't have to do all this. You can just put straight the signing key and it will just work. You don't need this line of code. Anyway, then you just doing the standard, HMAC SHA key for that number of bytes. It's getting all that. And then the other methods are basically, once you have a token, you give me the token and then give me the user details. I'm going to extract my username and I'll tell you if this token is valid or not, right? You need to make sure that username literally matches with the username that you're getting with the user details and also if the token expired. And again, this thing is all it's doing is it's calling the extract expiration, which is nothing but this guy. It just extracts a claim token and it just says from claims call this get expiration method, and that's what we're checking. Same thing, extract username is using that extract claim common method, which is basically right here, and it's just going to get the entire claim, and then out of that it will just say that, okay, what are you trying to do? So all we are trying to do here is we're trying to get the claim. What the claim is, it could be a get subject, it could be a get expiration. So these methods right here, and including this, of course, all it's doing is it's validating it, extracting whatever is in the token. It's kind of like deciphering, right? And the get token, in a way, it's ciphering. So that's the way to think about this. So that's that. Let's go to some of the other classes, what they're doing. Okay, let's move on to some of the other set of classes. So we talked about the config. Now let's look at the controller, because the controller's job is to basically take care of all of the URIs, right? So we're going to look at authentication controller first. There, all we have is the login and the logout, as you can see, right? So this only serves the login and logout, obviously, because that's the authentication controller, and it starts with /auth. If you recall, in our security, we had the /auth kind of open to public because that's where we have the login and logout. So what is login doing? Login is literally going to the authentication service. So it is taking help of the authentication service class, which is this guy right here. We'll come back to that. So from there, it's basically calling the login method. Once that happens, of course, it's passing this user request body, right? The users, all it is it's got username and password in there. That's all this is. That's what it's passing. And then once everything is authenticated, it is getting back the authenticated users object, right? And then that object is literally being passed. If you recall, in the JWT service, we saw something called generate token. After the login is done properly, then we are generating a token. After the token is generated, then all we are doing is getting that token and then sending a response back to the client. Now let's look at that guy. See this new response message? This response message is nothing but our custom response message that we created, which is right here. If you recall, and if you're not familiar, just go ahead and watch this video, because you will see that in this video we talk about that even in Express.js, whenever we are sending response, we're sending basically three things. One is the code, one is the message, but code in a sense is the status. One is the message, the other one is any result. Now this response message is pretty smart. What it does is, of course, it's got a status, got a message. The result can vary, so that is done like a template, right? Whatever template that you're using, so you could send a response message with an user's object. You can send a response message with the token object or anything else that you want. So that's what they will return in the result. So that's what that thing is. So again, we're using some custom response message to send it. Now in this one, if you look at it, the response message will be the type of user token. What is this thing defined? User token is defined in the not the model section, it would be in the bean section right here. So there's the user token right here. User can look at it exactly what that is. It's returning token, username, parse name, last name, authorities. Does that ring a bell? You will go and look at this previous video, like this guy right here. You will see that in the Angular, that is exactly what we are requiring. Same in the Express.js, you will see we are sending the similar information, because as soon as you log in, the user needs to see who the username is, first name, last name, and what are they logged in as. So these are useful information that you're sending back. So going back to authentication controller, so that's kind of what they got. And of course, the status will be 200. It's a success, and we are sending what? We are sending this new user token with the JWT token and authenticated user, right? And how does that work? If you go look at this guy, the constructor is out of the token. It literally sets the token, and then out of the users, it literally gets all the information, right? So that's how this thing is done. Then the logout is fairly simple. Logout is, of course, it is one of the things that we need to get is the authorization, like the header. What header we're looking for is authorization. Same thing, we're stripping out the JWT tokens out of that authorization header, right? What you're getting here, because we only need to check the token, and then out of that token, we're using the JWT service, if you remember, extracting the username, and then we're getting authentication object, and then we are making sure that these are not null, right? This is a valid user. If it's a valid user, then and only then we can do a logout. Of course, if you look at the JWT documentation, a 100% logout is not like, you can't really delete a token. All you could do is expire. So the token will automatically expire like in 30 minutes. But so we are still checking if it's valid or not. If it's valid, all we could do is invalidate the session. So that's exactly what this is doing, right? It doesn't just invalidate everything. Well, in a way, this is kind of like a no-op in a way, because our API is not using any session. But I just wanted to have this code just to show you that in a real web application, you can actually do stuff like this. Okay, that's it. And then user logs out successfully. And of course, it returns the standard message. And in this case, again, remember, our response message is templated. So this time it's returning a string, and the string is nothing but the username. So that's all this thing is doing. Now let's go look at the other service, like user service and user controller. Let's go look at the user controller first. So user controller, of course, that is kind of like the main one. After the user has been logged in, they have access to several different APIs, right? So here's the main context /users. Then they can also access / a specific user with an ID. They can access /add and update and delete with a specific ID, right? These are all self-explanatory. So let's look at each one of them. Of course, the first thing to note is it needs certain things. It needs a user repository. It needs help of user service. It also needs help for authentication service. So all of these things matters, right? So another thing to note, that even though this is a user controller, it is also using some services from authentication service, especially when you're trying to save a user. That's a private method, because this is being used by add and update both, right? When you're doing a save, it's calling authentication services sign up, right? Sign up is kind of like, signing up, like adding a new user. Why is that? Well, you can kind of go ahead and take a look at this method right here. So authentication service, which I haven't talked about, right? In the previous authentication controller, you remember that it calls a login. So let's talk about it here. In login, all it's doing is it's going to the authentication manager. Remember, authentication manager is a class from the Spring Boot. So it's literally saying, hey, authentication manager, authenticate me. How? With the new username password authentication from as this user, and this is the password, right? So if the authentication manager does not validate this thing, it will actually throw up an error, and you'll basically say, no, I couldn't do it, right? So that's what this guy is doing. So this guy is either going to fail or it's going to work. Okay, so after authenticating properly, then the next thing it's doing is, okay, it's all nice and good. Once that happens, then it is actually going to the user repository and says, all right, now go to find user by username, and then out of that user, just pass the user. So that's how this is working. It's fairly straightforward, but also using a lot of Spring Boot's API. Now let's look at the user repository quick. User repository is nothing but it is used in Spring Boot to kind of connect to the database in a seamless manner. We're not writing any queries, not doing a lot of things. It already extends an existing Mongo repository. Remember, we're using a Mongo database, right? And all the information are automatically retrieved by Spring Boot from this place right here. So going back to authentication service, so it's basically just saying that user repository call this method, and this method is going to extend from Mongo repository, and we're saying that this will be the main model that we're going to use that's going to get loaded from that model for the database, and this is the primary key, which is going to be an integer. That's the ID, right? Where is the model at? This is the model right here, and you can look it up. It looks kind of exactly like what you would think that a model would look. It's got it literally aligns with what we saw on the user collections, right? Tables, ID, username, password, first name, last name, and it's got an age, salary, and it also got authorities. Right? That is very simple, and it loads all of that information. The only thing that we need to add is this find users by username, because that is required, and all we have is just like a document-based query saying username, and we're going to pass some value, and this is the value that will be replaced by this little document-based query. So it will just fetch that specific user based on that username, because by default, remember, by default the primary key is the ID, not the username. So we need a separate method just to get the user by the username. So again, that's what's happening, and that's what is being called, and this literally returns the users, and that's how login gets the user after authenticating. If any of this fails, it's going to throw up, and you're going to get a forbidden exception. All right, the sign up, that's what we're talking about. It's kind of like saving a new user, right? Sign up is getting a new user, and then this is the main piece. It's getting a password, and then it needs to hash the password, right? Since this needs to hash the password, it needs to use a password encoder with that auto-wired bean. Remember, password encoder is defined in security configuration right here with the bcrypt thing, right? That's one of the reasons, going back to the point that I was trying to make, is we could not put the save method inside user service because it would throw an error. The reason is we're using a password encoder that is kind of like part of this authentication service. So in the sequence of loading, it needs to be loaded right here. So that's why. So anyway, going back to the user service that we're talking about, sorry, not user service, user controller rather, that we have this private method where it does a save and it calls authentication service and calls a sign up. So that's the reason. Anyway, so when all this thing is done, status is set, status message is set, and here we are sending a response message. If you remember, response message with the standard template object that we're using, it could be an edit user, it could be a user, it could be a string, it could be something that's user token. So this is just returned in the results, right? So in the results, it's returning user once the user is is added or is updated. So you can look it up right here. Add, it's calling save. Update, calling save. The only difference is in the add, it's setting the next sequence, next ID, right? So there's another method in the user service called next ID, where it just looks at the maximum one and just adds one to it, and we'll see it in a second. So the rest of the methods are just supporting the rest of the API. So nothing special about it. It's very self-explanatory, and you can see it. It's just calling standard user repository methods and calling the user services methods to do its stuff. So let's look at the user service to see exactly what it's doing. So in the user service, again, it's standard stuff. It needs the Mongo template because it is getting certain things or calling certain methods from Mongo template, and you'll see what that is. And it also needs the user repository because that's where it makes all the calls for the Mongo repository, right? The very first thing is the user service. If you look at it, it actually literally extends the user detail service, right? The user detail service is kind of like a standard class in Springboot. Whenever you use Spring Security and you're using the DAO service for the authentication provider, you need to make sure that you at least have something that you could specify as a user detail service, and inside that you have to override this method load user by username. So that's what this is doing. That's why I'm making the user service kind of like except from implementing the user detail service. So this is, as you can see, all it's doing is, first of all, it just gets the user, which is nothing but using the repositories as we looked at it, find user by username. So based on the username, not the actual ID, it gets the user, that user's object, and based on the user's object, it just constructs the user detail user object. That's all this thing, because it needs to return this user detail object, which is nothing but kind of like this type user. So, and it passes username, it passes the password, and also passes what are the list of authorities that it has. Everything is going to be there in this loaded in this user's model, right? Because it's loaded from the database. And again, this is just a trick to say that, hey, when you are getting a list of authorities and that is separated by comma, just split them out, map it, and turn it into a collection and a list. That's all this is saying, because this thing literally requires a list. In general, in our case, we are going to have one authority, the role admin or role user. But you can have multiple ones, and that's how you can automatically separate them from string and then turn it into a list. Okay, and then we talked about the next ID. This is that next ID method, that special thing. All this guy is doing is basically saying it is using the Mongo template, of course, with the find one, the query, passing query. The query, all it's doing is basically saying sort by descending which one by the ID, right? That's how we will get the largest ID at the top. And limit one basically saying just give me one row, so we'll get the first row on the top, and that would be literally the value of the ID, and then out of that it's basically getting the ID and adding one, and that's how you're getting the next ID. So pretty simple. And then this one is, of course, it's supported by the list of users. Get list of users, that's what this is. And get a specific user, that's what that is. And if you want to delete something, and delete. So these are just supported method in the service layer that is supporting the controller. So that's pretty much kind of it. The only other thing that I probably have not talked about is this guy right here, which is the global exception. That's just a standard exception handler that I added, and you could look at it. It's just literally self-explanatory to say what are the exception message that has been thrown if some of this thing happens. So that's about it. And I think this video has gotten really long, but I appreciate you staying with me so far. Hopefully this video has helped you to understand how the Springboot and MongoDB is connected, and you can create a literally robust REST API that also supports JWT token. Please do subscribe my channel and also hit the bell icon so that you can get notified for the subsequent videos. Next video, what I'm going to talk about is Springboot connecting to MySQL database, doing the exact same thing, but you're not changing the client. Angular will still work, but it will be just connecting to a MySQL database. Thanks. Bye now.